Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Mr. DarXnights. I know many of you use these videos to relax or fall asleep. So before you drift off, leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from. And if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable and begin. He was the kind of man you'd never suspect, polite, punctual, and harmless, until one quiet Ohio neighborhood realized their friendly mailman was delivering something far more permanent than letters: death. And by the time they figured it out, it was already too late, because their name had already been sealed in an envelope. Eugene Blake had walked the same route for over 20 years. Every morning at 7 a.m. sharp, his mail truck would pull up to the corner of Brookside Lane. He'd step out in his iron USPS uniform, cap snug on his balding head, clipboard in hand, and begin his rounds. The residents liked him. He always waved, smiled, even left extra dog treats for their pets. He remembered birthdays, asked about kids in college, and sometimes even shoveled driveways for the elderly during snowy months. He was exactly what you'd expect from a small-town mailman: harmless, dependable, invisible in a way that comes only with routine. No one noticed when the accident started. It began with Mrs. Cunningham, an 83-year-old widow who lived alone on the corner lot. She was found in her garage, slumped over in her car with the engine still running. Carbon monoxide poisoning, the coroner said. A tragic mistake. Maybe she had turned the engine on to warm the car and forgot to open the garage door. The town grieved. Eugene left flowers by her mailbox. A week later, Mr. Dalton slipped on the basement steps. He'd been carrying a box of old books, probably headed to the attic. His neck snapped in the fall. Another freak accident, the news said. These things happened. Families held tighter to each other. Neighbors double-checked their stair railings. Then it was a Wilson boy, 16 years old, drowned in his family pool. But he was a lifeguard at the local YMCA. How could he drown in 5 feet of water? Some said maybe he hit his head. Others whispered it might have been drugs. The toxicology report was clean. There was no explanation. The town didn't panic. It mourned quietly. People rationalized, told themselves it was coincidence. Random tragedy happens. But Lucas Hargrove didn't believe in coincidences. He lived on the same delivery route as all 3 victims. He noticed a pattern one morning as he watched Eugene stroll down the sidewalk, swinging his mail bag, stopping at each house. Mrs. Cunningham's house first, then Mr. Dalton's, then the Wilsons, in that exact order. Each one had died just days after receiving their usual mail. It wasn't just proximity, it was sequence. Something about it felt too clean. Lucas started watching the mailman, not just casually, but obsessively. He sat by the window every morning, timing Eugene's movements, taking notes. Eugene always followed the same path, house to house, with surgical precision. No backtracking, no breaks. His steps never varied, like a machine. When Eugene noticed Lucas watching him one morning, he offered a friendly wave. Lucas didn't wave back. He took his suspicions to his parents. They laughed, said he was spending too much time online, watching those crime documentaries that twisted everything into paranoia. Still, Lucas couldn't let it go. He began mapping out the neighborhood. 73 houses total. He circled the 3 where the deaths had occurred. Then, something else caught his eye. The next house on the mailman's route was the Myers, an elderly couple who rarely left the house. Mr. Meyer had survived a heart attack the previous year. Mrs. Meyer used a walker. Lucas felt a chill. The thought entered his mind uninvited. One of them was next. 2 days later, Mrs. Meyer collapsed in her garden. Official cause, stroke. But Lucas couldn't help noticing something. The ambulance had been called at exactly 11:08 a.m. That was the same time Eugene usually reached their mailbox. Lucas stopped sleeping. He pulled out old yearbooks, local newspapers, anything he could find. He started wondering if there were older deaths that followed the same route, patterns buried under years of forgetfulness. But Eugene had only been walking this specific neighborhood for 5 years. Before that, he worked 2 towns over. Lucas filed that away. He'd look into those other towns later. The neighborhood grew tense, though no one would say why. Doors stayed locked longer. People looked over their shoulders more often. Dogs barked when Eugene passed by. He still smiled, still waved. But there was something off now, something unnatural about his calmness, as if he were too at ease in a place that was unraveling. Lucas began to feel it deep in his gut. There was something wrong with Eugene Blake, something beyond ordinary, something that had been hiding in plain sight for years. He didn't know exactly what it was yet, but he could feel it. He had seen enough horror to know that evil didn't always wear a mask or hide in shadows. Sometimes it smiled. Sometimes it delivered your mail right on time. And something told him the next name on Eugene's invisible list might be his. Lucas couldn't ignore it anymore. The Myers incident had confirmed what his gut had been screaming for weeks. Something sinister was moving down Brookside Lane, and its footsteps matched those of the man in uniform. Every instinct told him the deaths weren't random. They weren't tragic accidents or freak misfortunes. They were methodical, calculated, planned. But who would believe that a mild-mannered mailman, a man who handed out dog treats and waved at toddlers, was somehow responsible for multiple deaths? It sounded insane. Even Lucas questioned his own reasoning sometimes, but the feeling never left him. It only grew worse. He knew if he didn't act soon, he might not get the chance. Something in his bones told him time was running out. One night, after Eugene's last shift, Lucas followed him. He kept to the shadows, staying low behind fences, watching from parked cars. Eugene didn't go straight home. Instead, he stopped at the old carriage house behind his modest split level, unlocked the rusted padlock, and slipped inside with a bulky black briefcase in hand. That building had once been a tool shed, long abandoned since Eugene's wife passed away. Rumors said he kept it locked ever since. No one ever saw him go in or out. No one thought to ask why. Lucas waited an hour before approaching. The yard was dark, silent. The carriage house looked lifeless from the outside. He tested the door locked, but the back window wasn't. A crack in the glass, wide enough to slip a hand through. With shaking fingers, he unlatched it and climbed inside. The smell hit him first, musty paper, decaying wood, and something else sour and metallic. A single light bulb dangled from the ceiling, swaying slightly from his entrance. Dust particles floated like ghosts in the air. What Lucas saw next would stay with him forever. One entire wall was covered in pinned envelopes. Dozens of them, yellowed paper, perfectly arranged in rows, each labeled in thick black ink. Names, addresses, some familiar, some crossed out with red pen. Each name matched the house on Eugene's route. The red lines, Lucas recognized them. They were the dead ones. Below the pinned envelopes sat a desk. On it lay an open binder, filled with printed obituaries, news clippings, even childhood photos of some of the victims. Typed notes had been added in neat, clinical handwriting. Wilbur Dalton, slippery staircase. Basement clutter confirmed. Eleanor Cunningham, garage ventilation failure. Carbon monoxide, no signs of struggle. It read like case files. Planned, predicted, executed. Lucas's heart pounded in his ears. He took a step back, breath catching. Then he saw it. The envelope on the desk, not pinned like the others. It had his name on it. Lucas Hargrove. For 17 Beckett Lane. Date, April 14th. His fingers trembled as he opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with the words, skateboard accident, back of the skull, backyard concrete steps, rain expected. He nearly dropped it. It was too specific. He had a skateboard. He used it daily. And yes, there were concrete steps behind his house. steps that became slippery when it rained. He remembered his mom nagging him about it just last week. And the weather app? It forecasted showers tomorrow. He wanted to scream, to burn the whole place down. But he knew no one would believe him without proof. He took out his phone, snapped photos of the wall, the desk, the files. His hands were slick with sweat, but he got everything. He climbed out the same window and ran all the way home. That night, Lucas didn't sleep. He stayed curled up on his bedroom floor, listening for footsteps, mail trucks, anything. He sent the photos to a throwaway email account, just in case something happened. His parents didn't believe him, said he was having a breakdown, called the school counselor. But Lucas knew what he saw. He knew Eugene Blake wasn't just a mailman. He was a collector, a record keeper, a quiet executioner with a route and a mission. The next morning, Lucas skipped school. Instead, he went straight to the police department with the photos. He expected chaos, urgency. Instead, he got puzzled stares and empty promises. An officer took his statement and said someone would look into it. When Lucas asked to speak to a detective, they told him one wasn't available. Later that night, he saw Eugene walking down the street, right on time, mailbag over his shoulder. He waved at Lucas, smiled, the same way he always did. Lucas ran back to the carriage house that evening. The window had been sealed, the door padlocked again. No light inside, no sound. He called the officer who took his report voicemail. The next morning, he returned with bolt cutters, but the entire shed had been emptied. Every envelope, every photo, every note, gone. The walls were bare. The desk was gone, but the smell remained. That strange, coppery staleness that made the back of his throat tighten. Later that day, Lucas checked his mailbox. No mail, just a single white envelope. Blank. No name. No return address. Just sealed. He didn't open it. Not yet. In the quiet past of Eugene Blake, hidden beneath years of silence and small-town normalcy, lay a tragedy no obituary ever mentioned. His son, Darren, had once been a bright, curious boy with a wild imagination and a temper no one could tame. Most neighbors remembered him as a kid with too much energy and too few friends, often seen drawing alone on the sidewalk while other children played. What they didn't see was the darkness that grew in the corners of his mind. By the time Darren turned 12, teachers had noted disturbing behavior, graphic stories, violent drawings, sudden outbursts. He spoke often of vengeance, of justice, of punishing those who laughed at him, excluded him, ignored him. No one took it seriously. After all, he was just a child. Children say things. They grow out of it. But Darren didn't get the chance to grow out of anything. One cold autumn morning, while riding his bike to school, Darren was struck by a pickup truck. The driver, a neighbor, claimed it was an accident. That Darren had darted into the road, headphones in, not looking. There were no cameras, no witnesses. The case was closed in days. The town mourned. The funeral was small. And Eugene never recovered. Something inside him broke that day. He withdrew from friends, skipped church, ignored block parties. His wife, already battling illness, grew worse in the months that followed. When she passed from cancer just a year later, Eugene was left alone, hollowed out by grief. The only thing that kept him going, he said, was the routine of his postal route. Delivering mail gave his day structure, gave him a reason to keep walking. But not everything stayed buried. After his wife's death, Eugene spent long hours in the old carriage house. Neighbors heard the sound of hammering, shelves being built, papers being sorted. No one asked questions. He was grieving. They thought, let him be. Let him find peace. What no one realized was that Eugene had discovered something in Darren's room. A journal, several of them, hidden beneath loose floorboards. They were filled with names, classmates, teachers, local shop owners, even neighbors. Each entry contained imagined punishments, vivid and chilling in detail. It was Darren's private world, a fantasy revenge map of the people he believed had wronged him, ignored him, or failed to protect him. Eugene read every word, and something inside him began to shift. At first, he told himself it was just grief, just a way to stay connected to Darren. But the longer he read, the more he started to agree with his son's twisted logic. Darren wasn't just a lonely, angry boy. He was a prophet of justice, and his lists were commandments. The town had taken everything from him. Now, Eugene would deliver something back. So the wall of envelopes began. At first, it was symbolic, just names, copied from the journals, arranged in delivery order. But grief has a way of warping reason. Soon, Eugene began researching his targets, their habits, their routines, their weaknesses. Every accident on Brookside Lane mirrored something Darren had written years before. Eugene wasn't just mourning his son. He was finishing his son's story. Each death became a chapter, each envelope a warning. And Eugene, now playing both father and executioner, became obsessed with precision. There could be no suspicion, no mistakes. Every death had to appear natural, coincidental, invisible to the eyes of police and neighbors. He perfected the art of proximity, always close enough to watch, never close enough to blame. And he kept records, detailed, disturbing records, clippings, maps, reenactments. It wasn't enough to avenge Darren. He wanted to relive it, over and over. He wanted to feel the justice unfold, quietly, cleanly, until the route was complete. But there was one name Darren never wrote down: Lucas Hargrove. Lucas hadn't known Darren well. They were 4 years apart, practically strangers. But Lucas lived in a house that shared a fence with the boys' yard. And in Eugene's twisted logic, Lucas was part of the neighborhood that had failed his son. He was part of the system. An accidental name, one added late. A new generation to be punished for the sins of the old. Lucas's envelope had been a test, a prediction. Eugene had seen him skating, noted the worn step behind his house, checked the forecast. Rain. It would look like an accident, just like the others. But Lucas had found the files too soon, and now Eugene knew he was being watched. But instead of retreating, he evolved. He burned the files, emptied the shed, destroyed the evidence. But he didn't stop. The list wasn't over. There were still names to deliver, still people to visit. The route was sacred. And in his mind, Darren was walking beside him, pointing, whispering, smiling. The mail still came, on time, quiet as ever. But now, the envelopes were blank. No names, no addresses, just a quiet seal. And once they appeared, someone always disappeared. There was only one house left on the route, a quiet, ivy-covered bungalow at the end of Ashwood Court, a cul-de-sac few people ever noticed. It had sat empty for years, left unsold after the last owners moved away under strange circumstances. Some said the place was cursed, bad energy, odd noises, cold spots in summer. Others claimed it was simply old and forgotten. But Eugene knew the truth. The house was not an afterthought. It was the end of the line. The final name on Darren's list had no address, just a crude drawing of a house and one word underneath: me. At first, Eugene hadn't understood. He thought perhaps it was an unfinished entry, a mistake, a symbol of something Darren never completed. But as time passed and the names dwindled and the town grew quieter, he began to grasp the true meaning. The route didn't end with someone else. It ended with him. Every step he had taken, from the first envelope to the latest death, had not only been a tribute to Darren, but a slow spiral inward. The justice he believed he was serving had always been self-inflicted. The pain he delivered was a reflection of the guilt he never faced. Eugene wasn't just a messenger. He was a final message. The house at the end of Ashwood Court was symbolic. It represented isolation, decay, the slow rot of memory. It was a place where Darren had once hidden after a fight at school, the same house Eugene had searched for hours to find him in, only to discover his son curled up on the back porch, bruised and sobbing. That day had changed them both, and Darren had never forgotten it. The drawing in the journal wasn't random. It was a grave. Over the following weeks, Eugene began to prepare, not for death, but for closure. He rewalked the route every morning, though the deliveries had long stopped. The envelopes were no longer part of the system. They were rituals. He placed them in mailboxes as reminders, not to others, but to himself. Reminders of what he had done, what he had become. He began to hear things. A bicycle bell, footsteps in the leaves, a voice calling from the corner of his thoughts. It was always Darren's voice, younger than he remembered, softer than it had ever been in life. And it wasn't angry. It was expectant. It was waiting. People in the town began to grow uneasy, not because of what they knew, but because of what they sensed. A pattern had emerged, though no one dared speak it aloud. Every household that had once whispered about the Blakes, mocked Darren, or dismissed Eugene had suffered loss. Sudden, unexplained. Those who remained walked faster now, looked over shoulders, avoided the mailman's eyes. They knew something was wrong, but couldn't name it. The silence of the town grew heavier with each delivery, but still Eugene walked, until one morning, the envelope arrived at his own door. He didn't remember placing it, didn't recall writing the name, but it was there on his front step under the doormat, just like all the others. No stamp, no address, just his name in Darren's handwriting. It was time. He took the key to the house on Ashwood Court and unlocked the door for the first time in decades. Dusk greeted him like old sorrow. The air was thick with stillness, as if the house had been waiting untouched, unbreathing. He brought nothing with him, no tools, no books, no food, just the envelope. And the guilt. Inside, he found the remnants of the past. Scratch walls, a rusted tricycle, a broken clock stopped at 3:17. Memories that weren't his flashed in the corners of his mind. Darren had imagined this place as the final stop, a shrine, a sentence. Eugene understood now. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about recognition. Darren had wanted to be seen, heard, felt, and in the end, Eugene was the only one who ever truly listened. The house became his prison. He stopped returning home. His mailbag hung empty. Neighbors who once feared his gaze now noticed his absence and grew even more afraid. Some said they saw him walking the cul-de-sac at night, envelope in hand, talking to shadows. Others swore they heard a child's voice echoing from the boarded windows. No one dared enter. Months passed. Then one day, the house caught fire. No cause was found. No body was recovered. But in the ashes, investigators discovered a metal mailbox nailed to the inside of the basement door. Inside it was a single, sealed envelope. The ink had burned away, but the shape of the name pressed into the paper remained. It was Darren's. To this day, no one walks past Ashwood Court. The road remains closed. The lot overgrown. Some say they see a figure in a faded male uniform standing where the porch once was. Others hear the creak of a bicycle chain in the wind. And sometimes, just sometimes, a blank envelope appears in an old, forgotten mailbox. No name, no return address, only silence and the sound of footsteps walking away. Story 2. In 1998, 5 boys made a blood pact during a Halloween sleepover. Now, more than 2 decades later, they're dying one by one, each found with the same haunting message. I didn't forget. But what if one of them never made it out of that house alive, and he's the one keeping the promise? 5 boys gathered in a small, quiet town on Halloween night in 1998. The air was sharp with autumn chill, and the neighborhood streets were littered with fallen leaves, still carrying faint traces of pumpkin and smoke from backyard fires. Each boy came from a family that didn't know much about what the others were planning that evening. Only that it was a sleepover unlike any before, a night to mark the end of childhood and the beginning of secrets that would linger for years. They met in one boy's basement, a place thick with the smell of old carpet and the faint echo of their laughter bouncing off the bare walls. Their names were Marcus, Liam, Jason, Derek, and Ethan, 5 inseparable friends who had grown up side by side, riding bikes, playing ball, and dreaming about the future. That night, the usual games and jokes gave way to something darker, something charged with the electricity of the unknown. The boys began to tell ghost stories, each trying to outdo the other. Tales of spirits wandering cemeteries, shadows that slipped behind bedroom doors, and whispers caught on the wind filled the room. Their voices lowered with each story, eyes wide with a mix of fear and excitement. The oldest story was always the most terrifying. The legend of a boy who vanished from their town decades ago, never found, leaving behind only an unfinished diary and a mystery that the townspeople preferred to forget. As the hours passed and the clock hands crept toward midnight, the atmosphere shifted. A dare was issued to find a cursed object hidden in the woods behind the house, but no one dared follow through. Instead, they made a pact, a blood pact, as they called it, using the small, sharp knife Ethan's older brother left behind. Each boy pricked his finger, pressing it onto a scrap of paper, sealing the promise to remain best friends forever and to return to this very spot every Halloween night, no matter where life took them. The pact was more than a game. It was a vow sealed in blood and silence, binding them to each other and to a night that none of them would fully understand until much later. They swore not to tell anyone, not even their parents, about the pact or what they had witnessed. It was their secret, sacred and heavy, a line crossed into adulthood where childhood innocence began to crack. But when the morning light filtered to the basement window, the weight of that night grew unbearable. One of the boys, Ethan, was gone. Not missing, not at a friend's house. Simply gone. The others searched frantically, calling his name, checking every corner of the house and yard. But there was no sign. The police were called, and a search began, but after days, weeks, and then months, no trace of Ethan was found. The town slowly buried the story. Whispers turned to silence, and silence to forgetfulness. The families pretended that nothing was wrong, that the boy had run away or wandered off somewhere. But deep beneath the surface, the memory lingered, an invisible scar on the community. The remaining 4 boys never spoke about what had happened that night, not even to each other. What really occurred in that basement, what secrets were shared in the dark hours of Halloween, was locked away, unspoken and unacknowledged. The blood pact, meant to unite them forever, became a haunting reminder of a night filled with fear, guilt, and something unexplainable. Each year, on Halloween, the boys returned to their separate lives, carrying the weight of a vanished friend and a promise that might never be broken. Over time, the friends drifted apart. The magic of childhood friendship faded beneath the shadows cast by the disappearance. Their lives took different paths, cities, careers, and families, but the ghost of that night clung to them like a second skin. The silence was louder than any words, and the question that no one dared ask whispered in every corner. What happened to Ethan after the pact was sealed? And why did the others never speak of it? The answer remained locked away in memories too painful to face. The town moved on. Children grew up, and the legend of the missing boy turned into a cautionary tale told in hushed voices around campfires. But for the 4 remaining friends, Halloween was never just a night of candy and costumes. It was a reminder of a bond forged in blood and fear, and a secret that will refuse to stay buried. The night of the pact was the beginning of a mystery no one wanted to solve. The start of a story that would unravel slowly, piece by piece, until the truth could no longer be hidden. Years passed after the Halloween night in 1998, and the small town where the 5 boys once lived changed with the seasons. Streets were repaved, new families moved in, and the memories of that fateful sleepover began to fade into obscurity. except for 4 survivors who carried the weight of what had happened that night in their own separate ways. In the present day, those boys have become men scattered across different cities, their lives far removed from the innocence of childhood. Marcus, once the fearless leader of the group, now lived a quiet life as an accountant in Chicago. Liam had become a schoolteacher in New York. Passionate about helping children, but haunted by the past he could never explain. Jason worked long hours as a mechanic in their hometown, trying to fill the void left by lost friendships. Derek had chosen a career in law enforcement, his sharp instincts perhaps born from years of trying to make sense of the unexplainable. Despite the distance, the 4 men remained tethered to memory of their missing friend, Ethan, though the years had dulled the sharp edges of that night. The pact they made lingered as a shadow on their lives, a secret pact that none dared to break. Then, suddenly, everything began to unravel. Marcus was the first to hear the news. A call in the early morning hours from a local police department informed him that Liam had been found dead in his apartment. The cause of death was suspicious, an apparent overdose, but something about the scene unsettled everyone involved. Beside Liam's body lay an old Halloween mask, worn and cracked, and a small note scrawled in familiar handwriting. "I didn't forget." The note was a chilling echo of the past, a reminder that the blood pact was not a forgotten childhood game, but a binding promise with consequences no one fully understood. As the news spread, the remaining men were forced to confront the fear they had long buried. Jason and Derek were contacted separately, each receiving the same haunting message. The shock was immediate, but denial followed quickly. They told themselves it was a coincidence, a tragic accident amplified by superstition. After all, 25 years had passed. What could possibly connect Liam's death to their childhood promise? But then, just days later, Jason was found dead in his garage, the scene eerily similar to Liam's. The same Halloween mask lay nearby, and the note, "I didn't forget," was again left behind. This time, there was no doubt. Someone was delivering a message, and it was meant for them. The one solid foundation of their friendship began to crumble under the weight of paranoia and guilt. Derek, now alone, felt the walls closing in. The men had always carried the unspoken secret of that night, but now it was coming back with vengeance, demanding answers they were afraid to face. Strange occurrences followed. Derek reported feeling watched, hearing footsteps in empty rooms, shadows flickering at the edges of his vision. His phone rang in the dead of night with no one on the line, a chilling reminder that the past was not done with them. The blood pact had become a curse. The deeper they looked, the more fragmented their memories became. Each man struggled to recall details from that night, only to be met with a fog of silence. The missing boy, Ethan, had never been found, but the truth about his disappearance was tangled in a web of fear and guilt they all shared but never voiced. Derek began to investigate the past more obsessively than the others. He dug through old police reports, photographs, and town records, searching for any clue that might explain the nightmare unfolding around them. What he found was disturbing. The photograph of the group the morning after the sleepover only showed 4 boys. Ethan was nowhere to be seen. That absence was a wound in their shared history, a mystery they had all ignored. The more Derek uncovered, the clearer it became that their childhood friend's disappearance was not a simple tragedy, but something far more sinister. The town had buried the truth, burying Ethan with it. It was as if a collective amnesia had settled over the community, refusing to acknowledge the darkness lurking beneath the surface. Meanwhile, the remaining men's lives were falling apart. Fear consumed them, isolating each man in his own private hell. Messages and symbols began appearing. Cryptic drawings, references to their pact, reminders that the promise they made was still alive. The question loomed, who was behind these deaths? Was it one of them, or was it something else? Something tied to the missing boy, to the night they swore to never speak of again? The blood pact was not just a childish game. It was a chain that connected the past and present, binding them to a fate they could not escape. The message, "I didn't forget," was a warning and a reckoning, a declaration that whatever had started 25 years ago was far from over. Derek's investigation revealed whispers of shadow lurking in the town's history, tales of vengeance, of promises made in blood and broken in silence. The missing boy had become more than a memory. He was a symbol of a reckoning no one was prepared to face. As the bodies piled up and the shadows lengthened, the remaining men realized they had no choice but to return to beginning, to confront the pact and the secrets buried beneath it. The nightmare they thought was behind them had only just begun. The unraveling of the past forced Derek into a confrontation with memories long suppressed, emotions carefully locked away in the deepest corners of his mind. The weight of the blood pact was more than just a childhood promise. It was a burden that tethered the men to a cycle of tragedy they could neither escape nor fully comprehend. The deaths of Liam and Jason, so eerily staged and accompanied by that chilling note, shattered the fragile illusion that time could heal all wounds. It became clear that their missing friend, Ethan, was not merely a victim of some tragic accident or unfortunate disappearance. He had become the centerpiece of a dark and twisted game, one that blurred the lines between vengeance, guilt, and something far more sinister. The question haunted Derek. Was Ethan still alive? Or had the boy's death marked the beginning of something malevolent? Something that would not rest until it claimed them all? Derek's investigation deepened into the town's forgotten archives. Old newspaper clippings revealed little but hints. Faint references to disappearances, strange occurrences, and unexplained tragedies spanning decades. Patterns emerged, linking the missing boy's case to a series of unsolved mysteries, all bearing the same eerie hallmarks of silence and denial. The town's unwillingness to speak of these events suggested a collective complicity, a desire to bury what could not be understood or controlled. Among these documents, Derek found an old diary, purportedly belonging to Ethan himself. Its pages were brittle and stained with age, but the words within spoke volumes, fragments of troubled boy grappling with isolation and fear. The diary chronicled feelings of abandonment, hints of a growing darkness that surrounded him, and cryptic warnings about a force stalking the town, one that sought to punish not just individuals but entire families. The diary hinted at a curse, a malevolent presence tied to the very land on which the town stood. It spoke of bloodlines stained by secrets and lies, of sins passed from generation to generation. Ethan's last entries were desperate and fragmented, a boy on the brink of something terrible, pleading for someone to believe him, to break the chain of silence. The more Derek uncovered, the more the blood pact took on new meaning. It was no longer just a childish vow, but a link in a chain of supernatural retribution. The pact bound the boys not only to each other, but to the fate of the town itself, entwining their destinies with a dark legacy that Ethan had tried to expose. As Derek pieced together these revelations, his own reality began to fray. Strange phenomena intensified. Shadows moving where no light should fall, whispered voices that slipped through cracks in the silence, and fleeting glimpses of a figure that seemed to linger just beyond sight. The line between the physical world and something otherworldly blurred, eroding his sense of safety and sanity. The blood pact, once a symbol of friendship and loyalty, was now a curse marked by death and despair. Each death was a message, a warning that the past was not done with them, that the sins of their families and the silence of the town had invited a darkness that would not be ignored. Derek reached out to the other men, desperate to break the isolation that threatened to consume them all. Marcus, though miles away, responded with a mixture of fear and resignation. The years of silence between them now felt like a lifetime, but the blood pact had rekindled a connection none could deny. They spoke cautiously, sharing memories, piecing together fragments of that night that none had dared revisit until now. Together, they realized that their childhood friend's disappearance was just the beginning. The true horror was the legacy Ethan had left behind, a legacy that demanded reckoning. The pact, sealed in blood, was a promise to protect each other, but it was also a tether to a darkness that wanted retribution. Their silence, their denial, had allowed the shadows to grow. As the remaining men prepared to return to the town, and confront the nightmare head-on. They knew the truth would come at a price. They would have to face not only the secrets of the past, but the fear and guilt buried deep within themselves. The blood pact was no longer just a promise of friendship. It was a sentence. And the reckoning had only just begun. The remaining men, Derek and Marcus, stood at the edge of the precipice neither could fully see, but both felt pulling them downward. The past was no longer a distant memory. It was a living force, wrapping itself tighter around their lives with every passing day. The blood pact was not just a promise between friends. It was an unbroken chain of consequences, binding them to a fate that had been set in motion decades ago. Their plan was simple in theory. Return to the town, retrace the steps of that final night, and uncover what had truly happened to Ethan. But the simplicity was deceptive. Each step closer to the truth only unearthed deeper layers of darkness and deceit. Layers the town had deliberately buried. Layers they had once chosen to forget. The town's atmosphere had changed in their absence. The streets seemed quieter, but there was an undercurrent of unease. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones, glancing nervously at one another, avoiding the eyes of strangers. The very air felt heavier, thick with unspoken fears and memories better left undisturbed. In searching for answers, Derek and Marcus revisited old haunts. The playground where they once played, the abandoned house where they held the infamous sleepover, and the forest edge where Ethan was last seen. Each location carried an oppressive silence, as if the land itself mourned the loss of innocence and hid a secret too painful to reveal. More disturbing were the signs they began to find. Strange symbols etched into trees, old photographs torn and scattered, and anonymous messages warning them to stop digging. It was clear someone or something wanted the past to stay buried, but fear could not stop them now. The diaries and notes Derek uncovered painted a picture of a town trapped in a cycle of guilt and retribution. The blood pact was not merely a childish game. It was a link in a chain of vengeance that stretched back generations. Ethan's disappearance was tied to a legacy of broken promises, and sins too dark to speak aloud. It became clear the blood pact was a curse as much as it was a promise. The pact connected the boys not only to each other, but to the town's shadowed history. Families were bound by secrets, and the pact was a bloodline marker, an unbroken chain of silent guilt and whispered horrors. Derek and Marcus found themselves pulled deeper into a web of supernatural influence. The line between reality and nightmare blurred. Visions of a young boy, pale and hollow-eyed, appeared at the edges of their vision. Whispers filled the quiet moments, calls for justice, pleas for release. The presence felt both vengeful and mournful, a spirit trapped by the cruelty of the past and the silence of the living. Ethan's spirit was not at rest, and his disappearance was not the end, but the beginning of a reckoning that demanded acknowledgement. The men faced a terrible truth. The blood pact had been more than a secret. It was a binding spell, a curse that punished the living for the sins of the past. Every death, every mysterious note left behind, was a chapter in a story they'd ignored for too long. As they pieced the puzzle together, they realized that breaking the pact would require confronting the darkest parts of themselves and their families. It meant confessing the lies, exposing the secrets, and accepting responsibility for the silence that had allowed the darkness to grow. The final revelation came with a painful clarity. Ethan had not vanished by accident. He was taken, sacrificed in a ritual born from desperation and fear, a misguided attempt to protect the town from a greater evil. The blood pact was a price paid to keep that evil sealed, a promise forged in pain and kept in silence. But silence had a price. The pact demanded retribution, and now, years later, it was claiming its toll. The deaths were not random. They were part of an ancient balance, a dark ledger that required equal exchange. Derek and Marcus understood their path forward. They would have to break the cycle. They would have to face the darkness, not with fear, but with courage. To honor their friend, to end the curse, they needed to expose the truth and demand justice. The blood pact was more than a memory. It was a legacy of pain, a haunting that could only be ended by acceptance and courage. The reckoning was here, And only by facing the past could they hope to survive the future. End of story 2. Story 3. In the remote wilderness of Wisconsin, a forgotten cabin holds a dark secret no one was meant to find. Police uncovered decades-old VHS tapes showing brutal murders, filmed with chilling detail in a place with no electricity, no road access, and no witnesses. But the nightmare doesn't end there. On the final tape, one officer makes a horrifying discovery. Their own missing sibling trapped in the footage, lost just last week. What twisted horror lurks inside the hunting cabin tapes? And can they escape the nightmare before becoming the next victims? The discovery of the hunting cabin was anything but ordinary. Nestled deep within the dense Wisconsin wilderness, the cabin seemed almost invisible, concealed by years of overgrowth and the relentless advance of nature. No road led to it. Only faint animal trails hinted at its presence. For decades, it had escaped the notice of hunters, hikers, and even the occasional search parties looking for missing persons. That very isolation made the cabin an enigma, a forgotten relic frozen in time. The initial lead came from a local informant, someone who preferred to stay anonymous but whose information could not be ignored. The recent disappearance of a young woman had reignited interest in the area, prompting law enforcement to search the forested expanse with renewed urgency. The woman's last known location was near the outskirts of the wilderness, but nothing had been found. No footprints, no signs of struggle, no clues at all, until the tip about the cabin surfaced. Approaching the cabin was a surreal experience. The exterior was battered by time and weather. The wooden planks were weathered and cracked, the roof sagging under the weight of decades of snow and rain. There was no sign of life, no smoke from a chimney, no footprints in the mud. Only an overwhelming silence that pressed down like a weight. The windows were grimy and opaque, preventing any glimpse inside. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere shifted. The stale, musty air held a scent of decay and neglect. But what shocked investigators most wasn't the cabin's derelict state. It was the discovery of a collection of VHS tapes carefully stacked in a metal box. The tapes bore handwritten labels, some dating back nearly 20 years, while others were more recent, suggesting ongoing activity. The presence of the tapes raised questions that pierced through the silence. Who had been living here? Why had no one noticed the cabin all these years? And most chillingly, what was recorded on these tapes that someone went to the trouble of preserving them in such a remote place? The tapes themselves were fragile, yellowed with age, and carried an eerie weight as if they contained secrets too heavy to bear. No electronic equipment existed in the cabin, yet the tapes were clearly meant to be viewed. Someone had recorded and stored them meticulously, hidden away from prying eyes. As investigators began to review the tapes at the precinct, the true horror began to emerge. The footage was grainy, sometimes shaky, often filmed from crude angles. It showed disturbing scenes, victims, sometimes bound or struggling, sometimes eerily calm, filmed in a place unmistakably the same cabin. The recording spanned years, depicting a systematic and calculated pattern of violence. What was especially terrifying was the realization that these acts had gone unnoticed by the outside world. The victims had never been reported missing, and no evidence suggested the authorities had ever connected the dots. The tapes revealed a grim timeline of abductions and murders, each meticulously documented by the perpetrator. The recordings were devoid of sound at times, enhancing the disturbing visual evidence of terror and pain. There was no clear motive given, only the undeniable evidence of cruelty and suffering captured on tape, as if the killer viewed the cabin as a stage for their darkest fantasies. One tape, however, stood out from the rest. It was more recent and, unlike the others, bore a handwritten label that sent a ripple of shock through the investigating team. The name was familiar, someone who had been reported missing just days before the cabin was found. Worse yet, the footage seemed to show this person alive, trapped in the cabin, pleading silently for help that could never come. The implications were staggering. The cabin was not only a crime scene frozen in time, It was an active nightmare. The killer had been operating with impunity for years, using the remoteness and isolation of the forest to hide the most unspeakable horrors. And now, the nightmare had reached into the present. The investigation took on new urgency. The cabin was no longer just a forgotten relic. It was the center of a sprawling mystery with ties to recent disappearances and unsolved crimes. Questions multiplied. How many victims were there? How had the killer avoided detection for so long? And most terrifyingly, was the perpetrator still out there, watching, waiting? The discovery of the hunting cabin and its tapes challenged everything investigators thought they knew about the area and the people who lived there. It revealed a darkness lurking beneath the surface of a quiet, seemingly peaceful community. What had once been assumed as isolated incidents now formed a web of terror spanning decades. As law enforcement delved deeper, the lines between past and present began to blur. The tapes became windows into a horrifying world, a world where the silence of the forest was broken only by the sound of fear, and the shadows held secrets that refused to stay buried. The cabin stood as a monument to cruelty hidden in plain sight, its walls soaked in secrets and lies. With each new tape watched, the chilling truth unfolded, that some nightmares are real and sometimes they're recorded forever. The contents of the tapes revealed a nightmare far worse than anyone had imagined. As the investigators painstakingly reviewed hours of grainy footage, a pattern began to emerge, one marked by meticulous planning, cold calculation, and a chilling obsession that spanned decades. The tapes, shot in a crude yet deliberate manner, chronicled acts of violence so methodical that they seemed almost ritualistic. Each victim was captured from multiple angles, their faces etched with fear, confusion, and despair. There was no mercy in the recordings, only a haunting documentation of terror. The killer's method was clear: lure victims to cabin or abduct them from nearby areas, isolate them completely, and then subject them to torment, all while filming every moment. The camera angle suggested that the perpetrator was both voyeur and executioner, taking a twisted pride in preserving these acts as trophies. Yet the tapes were not merely about violence. They were carefully labeled with dates and cryptic notes, as though the killer was tracking progress or following a personal agenda. This was not random brutality. It was a calculated, ongoing project. What made the tapes even more disturbing was the apparent detachment of the killer. There was no audible sound on many tapes, stripping the footage of context and leaving viewers to imagine the horrors that took place. The silence amplified the terror, forcing the imagination to fill in the gaps with the worst possible scenarios. Occasionally, fragments of whispered voices or strained breathing pierced the quiet, hinting at the suffering endured. The killer's face rarely appeared on camera, further deepening the mystery. Was this a single individual, or were others involved? One tape, marked with date from nearly 2 decades ago, showed the earliest known victim. The footage was raw and unrefined, but the scene was horrific. A young woman, bound and pleading, her terror palpable even through the flickering video. The setting was unmistakably the same cabin, its cold wooden walls bearing witness to unspeakable acts. Over the years, the tapes grew more sophisticated. Camera work improved, the violence more chillingly choreographed. This evolution suggested not only experience, but a growing obsession that fed on control and domination. Another striking aspect was the absence of any attempts to cover up the crimes. The killer did not hide the victims' faces or blur any parts of footage. Instead, the tapes served as a detailed archive, almost a morbid diary. The labels hinted at a twisted timeline, with some tapes referencing specific events or people connected to the nearby town. The sense of a message being sent, a narrative being constructed, was undeniable. It was as if the killer wanted the world to see, to remember, even if only these tapes survived. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the victims shared one chilling link. None had ever been reported missing. The killer chose individuals who existed on the fringes, people whose disappearances would go unnoticed. homeless individuals, transit workers, the socially isolated. This selection method allowed the killer to operate without raising suspicion, to continue the pattern unchecked. The tapes provided the only record of these lost lives, frozen forever in moments of horror. Among the more recent tapes, dated just weeks before the cabin's discovery, the tone shifted dramatically. The footage showed an individual who bore an uncanny resemblance to someone the investigators knew, a young woman who had vanished from a nearby town, her disappearance still fresh and unresolved. Unlike the earlier victims, she appeared more defiant, struggling fiercely against her restraints. Her eyes, wide and alert, betrayed both terror and a desperate hope for escape. The camera lingered on her face for long, unsettling moments, as though the killer wanted to ensure her story was captured in full. This particular tape sparked a wave of urgency among the investigators. The realization that the killer was still active, or at least recently active, turned the case from a historical crime into a race against time. If the woman was still alive, trapped somewhere near the cabin, the chances of her survival were slim without immediate intervention. The tape suggested not only a record of death, but potentially a map to ongoing horror. Adding another layer of complexity was a discovery of symbols and markings scattered throughout the footage, cryptic codes etched onto walls, strange objects placed deliberately within the camera's frame. These hints pointed to a possible motive beyond simple sadism. Some investigators speculated that the killer was enacting a ritual or fulfilling a personal vendetta. The symbols seemed tied to local folklore or perhaps a private mythology, a dark narrative only the perpetrator fully understood. The more the tapes were studied, the clearer it became that the killer was reliving something through these acts, a story of pain, revenge, or loss. The dates on the tapes matched anniversaries and significant events in the town's history, suggesting connection between the crimes and a past tragedy. Was the cabin itself a shrine to this dark history? And if so, what had driven someone to commit such atrocities in the name of that past? Every tape added pieces to the puzzle, but also deepened the mystery. Who was the mailman who delivered death? How did he justify these acts? Why had the town remained silent for so long? The tape's silence spoke volumes of fear, complicity, and secrets buried beneath the surface. Investigators began to realize that solving this case would require more than just forensic analysis and interviews. It demanded understanding the twisted psyche behind the camera, the motive that drove a man to kill in cold blood, and record it as proof of his dark legacy. The tapes were both evidence and confession, a window into a mind consumed by vengeance. As the search for answers intensified, so did the sense of dread. The cabin was not just a place of death. It was a monument to obsession, a shrine to revenge that haunted a community unwilling to confront its past. The tapes told a story that demanded to be heard, but listening came at a cost. Each new revelation carried the weight of horror, a reminder that evil can hide in the most unsuspecting places, and sometimes it arrives with the mail. The investigation took an unexpected and disturbing turn when the background of the mailman himself began to surface. His name was Harold Jenkins, a man who had once been a respected member of the Ohio community, known for his punctuality and quiet demeanor. For years, neighbors described him as reliable but reserved, someone who kept himself and never stirred trouble. Yet behind the facade of a harmless mail carrier, a dark history lurked, one intertwined with tragedy, grief, and a slowly unraveling mind consumed by vengeance. Harold's life had been marked by a series of personal losses that few in the neighborhood fully understood. His son, Matthew, had died under mysterious circumstances roughly 20 years before the discovery of the cabin. The official cause was ruled as an accidental drowning in a nearby lake, but whispers among locals hinted at something far more sinister. Matthew had struggled with mental health issues and social isolation, often withdrawn and tormented by unseen demons. Some suspected bullying. Others spoke of family secret kept hidden behind closed doors. The tragedy shattered Harold. Friends recall a man transformed by grief. Once cheerful and engaged, he became withdrawn, his eyes haunted by loss. Letters and messages uncovered during the investigation revealed a man obsessed with his son's death, haunted by guilt and consumed by a need for retribution. Slowly, a chilling theory emerged. Harold had begun to reenact a twisted form of justice for Matthew, targeting those he believed responsible for his son's suffering. The victims depicted in the tapes were not random. They were connected by a common thread, a network of people Harold blamed for Matthew's decline and death. Former classmates, bullies, even local officials who had dismissed pleas for help. Each act of violence was carefully chosen, a form of poetic justice in Harold's eyes. The delivery route of his mail became a symbolic map of his vendetta, a pathway to enact his revenge one victim at a time. Further investigation revealed that Harold had constructed the cabin as a private sanctuary for this dark crusade. The hidden room filled with envelopes wasn't just a collection of letters. It was a grim ledger, a catalog of intended victims with meticulous notes on each person's perceived sins against Matthew. This room became his twisted shrine, a place where grief and rage converged into something terrifyingly real. Authorities uncovered diaries and journals in Harold's home, filled with ramblings about justice, pain, and retribution. His writing revealed a fractured mind, struggling to reconcile the loss of his son with the need to punish others. There were moments of clarity, but more often, the words ascended into paranoia and delusion. Harold believed himself a messenger, a carrier not just of mail, but of fate itself, delivering death to those who had escaped accountability. Neighbors described strange sightings around the cabin in the years leading up to its discovery, lights flickering in the dead of night, distant sounds of muffled cries carried by the wind, and sometimes the eerie silhouette of Harold wandering the woods, lost in his own torment. Yet no one had the courage to intervene, fearing the man who once seemed harmless had become something else entirely. The investigation also uncovered a series of encrypted messages hidden within the envelopes. These codes appear to be part of a larger ritual, a symbolic enactment of Harold's revenge fantasy. Experts in cryptography and local folklore were brought in to decode these messages, which spoke of justice, sacrifice, and an unending cycle of pain. The chilling realization was that Harold's actions were not just about personal vengeance, but tied to a deeper, more disturbing ideology, one that justified murder as a form of cosmic balance. Harold's motive also seemed linked to the town's own dark past. Decades ago, the community had turned a blind eye to various injustices, bullying, neglect, and hidden violence that had been swept under the rug. Harold's mail route traced the veins of these buried secrets, his killings a brutal exposure of a community's collective guilt. The cabin was both the epicenter and the symbol of this reckoning. The profile of Harold as both grieving father and remorseless killer baffled investigators. It raised uncomfortable questions about the thin line between victim and perpetrator, and how grief could warp into a deadly obsession. His ability to operate undetected for so long spoke to a failure not just of the legal system, but the community itself. The silence and denial that allowed Harold's rage to fester became part of the tragedy. At the same time, the investigation grew more urgent. Authorities feared that Harold's timeline of revenge was not complete, that more names remained on his list, and more victims might be delivered to death. The recent disappearance of the young woman seen in the tapes was a stark reminder that the nightmare was not over. The question lingered. Had Harold acted alone, or were there accomplices hidden in the shadows? Efforts to track Harold's movements revealed chilling details about his final days. He had vanished without a trace shortly after the last recorded tape, leaving behind a trail of questions and unease. The cabin's isolation suggested he planned to disappear into the wilderness, but no confirmed sightings or evidence of his fate emerged. Some believed he had taken his own life. Others feared he was still out there, lurking and waiting to resume his grim work. The psychological unraveling of Harold Jenkins became a case study in how grief and trauma could catalyze monstrous actions. His story forced a reckoning not just with the murders, but with the societal failures that had allowed such darkness to grow unchecked. It was a haunting reminder that evil often hides behind familiar faces, and sometimes those who delivered death were the most ordinary masks. The discovery of the hidden room filled with envelopes marked a turning point in the investigation. Each envelope bore the name and address of a person Harold Jenkins had targeted, many of whom had already fallen victim to his twisted vendetta. The painstakingly organized collection revealed the chilling extent of his plan. Harold wasn't simply acting on impulse or random rage. He had mapped out his retribution with cold precision, choosing each target based on their connection to his son's tragic past. The envelopes contained more than just names. They held detailed accounts, photographs, and personal notes describing the reasons each individual had earned Harold's wrath. Some were accused of cruelty, others of indifference or negligence, but all were part of a narrative Harold had constructed, one that painted a picture of a community steeped in hidden sins. The mailman's delivery route was not accidental. It was a methodical pathway of punishment, a sequence designed to fulfill his son's imagined desire for justice. Investigators began reaching out to those still alive whose names were found in the envelopes. Many were shocked to learn they had been targeted. Some lived in fear, barricading themselves behind locked doors. Others dismissed the claims as paranoia, unwilling to confront the dark reality. The atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted dramatically, transforming from a quiet suburban area to a place gripped by suspicion and dread. The community's reaction was compounded by the disturbing realization that the killings had gone unnoticed for months, even years. Questions arose about how many chances had been missed to intervene, how many cries for help had been ignored or dismissed. This failure weighed heavily on local authorities and residents alike, sparking debates about accountability and the consequences of collective silence. Experts called and analyzed the psychological profile of Harold Jenkins, noted a man overwhelmed by grief, but whose mind had fractured into a labyrinth of delusion and obsession. His need for control and order manifested in the creation of the envelopes, which acted both as a blueprint and a ritualistic testament to his quest for vengeance. This system gave him a sense of purpose amid his anguish, but also turned him into a cold executor of brutal justice. Harold's actions forced a deeper examination of the community's history. It emerged that the town had long harbored unspoken tensions, cases of bullying, social exclusion, and even reported abuses that were quietly hushed up. These issues, left unresolved and hidden beneath the surface, created fertile ground for resentment and bitterness. Harold had internalized these wounds, channeling them into a campaign of terror that exposed the town's darkest secrets. The investigation also uncovered how Harold had manipulated his role as a trusted figure in the community to mask his intentions. As a mailman, he had unrestricted access to the homes and routines of his neighbors, allowing him to observe and choose his victims carefully. This position of normalcy and trust made his transformation into a killer all the more terrifying. It highlighted how evil could hide behind the most ordinary of faces. Law enforcement intensified efforts to protect those still on Harold's list, employing surveillance and community patrols. The atmosphere was tense, with residents fearful of who might be next. The ripple effect of the murders had fractured neighborhoods, sowing distrust and paranoia. The mailman's legacy became a grim lesson in how trauma left unaddressed could escalate into violence, affecting an entire community. Meanwhile, the fate of Harold Jenkins remained a mystery. Despite extensive searches, no conclusive evidence surfaced confirmed whether he had fled, remained in hiding, or taken his own life. This uncertainty added to the haunting nature of the case, leaving a lingering fear that the man behind the killings could still be out there, watching and waiting for his next opportunity. The story of the mailman who delivered death resonated beyond the boundaries of the Ohio town. It became a stark reminder of the consequences when grief morphs into vengeance and when communities fail to confront their shadows. The envelopes in that hidden room symbolized not just a list of victims, but a map of unresolved pain and fractured humanity. In the aftermath, the neighborhood struggled to heal. Support groups were formed. Conversations began about mental health and community responsibility, and efforts were made to break the cycle of silence that had allowed tragedy to fester. Harold Jenkins's dark journey served as a catalyst for change, pushing the community to reckon with its past and strive for a more vigilant and compassionate future. The legacy of the mailman was one of fear and sorrow, but also a warning. It underscored the importance of listening to grief, to warning signs, and to the voices too often ignored. It showed how a single person's pain, left unchecked, could ripple outward with devastating effects, transforming a quiet suburban neighborhood into the setting of a nightmare that no one could have imagined. As the investigation closed and the envelopes were secured as evidence, the community faced a daunting task of rebuilding trust. The shadow cast by Harold Jenkins' actions would not easily fade, but the hope remained that through acknowledgement and healing, the cycle of violence and silence could finally be broken. End of Story 3. Story 4. In the decaying heart of Detroit, where boarded-up homes echo with stories no one dares to finish, a viral TikTok claiming a ghost in a basement spirals into something far darker. When police finally dig beneath the house, they don't find a ghost. They find a mummified child chained and silent, but he wasn't always silent. For weeks, he had been reaching out to other kids, not through screams or spirits, but through a video game, begging for help under the haunting username, Help Me 417. What starts as a digital rumor ends with a crime scene that shocks even seasoned detectives. It started with a 15-second video, a grainy night vision clip posted by a group of teenage urban explorers on TikTok. The footage, uploaded with the caption Detroit Basement Ghost, showed little more than shaky flashlight beams, peeling walls, and the faint sound of something dragging in the darkness. But what caught everyone's attention wasn't the setting, it was the sound. A chilling, breathy cry, unmistakably human, unmistakably young. As the clip circulated across social media, racking up millions of views in hours, online communities went into overdrive. Paranormal forums dissected the footage frame by frame. True crime bloggers pointed out the street in the background matched a long-abandoned part of East Detroit. But then someone recognized something more sinister. The address was just a few blocks from where a young boy had vanished without a trace 5 years earlier. The missing boy's name was Marcus Lane, age 10 when he disappeared. He'd been walking home from school, his backpack later found in an alley near his home, but no other evidence ever turned up. The case had long since gone cold. His family moved away. No suspects were ever arrested. Over time, his story faded into the backlog of America's unsolved disappearances, until the TikTok clip surfaced, breathing life into a mystery that had never been fully laid to rest. As the video spread, a flood of anonymous tips poured into Detroit PD's online reporting portal. Several mentioned hearing whispers or strange cries from the same neighborhood over the years. One message stood out. It linked the strange sounds to a specific condemned home on Hastings Street. The sender claimed the cries had been ongoing for years, and that the house had once been occupied by a man who kept kids in the basement. At first, the tip was considered just another hoax, but something about it unsettled the reviewing officer enough to escalate it. Within days, police cordoned off the property for a welfare check. The home had been abandoned for months. No running water, no electricity, just a collapsing structure with a padlocked basement door. Using a crowbar, officers forced entry and found an immediate cause for concern. Scratch marks along the stairwell, along with children's shoes piled neatly on a shelf by the door. There was no one inside, no sign of life. But there was something else. The faint scent of decay. The case transitioned overnight from internet curiosity to a high-priority investigation. News trucks lined the street, while crime scene tape fluttered in the wind around the broken foundation. Authorities brought in forensic teams, cadaver dogs, and structural engineers to safely excavate the basement floor. What they found next would shake the city and the country. Beneath a layer of poured concrete, investigators unearthed a sealed crawl space. Inside lay the mummified remains of a child, curled in a fetal position, shackled at the ankles, with remnants of a torn superhero shirt still clinging to the bones. Around the corpse were crayons, a broken flashlight, and a spiral-bound notebook filled with shaky handwriting that looked like it belonged to a child. One line had been written over and over on multiple pages. "Tell them I'm here, please." Medical examiners estimated the child had been dead for over 3 years. The condition of the remains, along with the restraints and items found nearby, suggested prolonged captivity. A DNA match confirmed what many had feared. Marcus Lane had been found. But the shock didn't stop there. Hidden beneath the notebook was a rusted handheld gaming console, its battery long dead. Inside the cartridge slot was a custom game, unmarked, clearly modified. Police seized it for analysis. When news of the discovery reached the public, it sparked a firestorm. Protests erupted. The hashtag Justice for Marcus trended worldwide. People demanded answers. How had a missing child gone unnoticed for so long in a residential area? Why had no one followed up on the earlier noise complaints? And how is it possible that the first sign of truth came not from official investigations, but from a random TikTok video? Digital forensic experts examining the gaming device made a disturbing breakthrough. The custom game had an embedded chat feature, something only possible through local wireless play. Logs revealed the username, HelpMe417, had been active hundreds of times over the course of several months before the boy's death. The name had appeared in public chat rooms of a retro multiplayer game that had recently resurged in popularity among local teens. As more parents came forward, claiming their children had chatted with HelpMe417, the story deepened. Some kids recalled eerie messages they thought were jokes or roleplay. "It's cold down here. He doesn't let me eat today. I'm under the floor." At the time, they laughed, assumed it was someone pretending to be a ghost or just another player trolling. No one had considered the possibility that the messages were real. No one imagined that a trapped child was reaching out the only way he could, through the limited, wireless range of a hacked video game cartridge. By the time authorities realized the implications, the horror had already unfolded. A child had died calling for help through game consoles, his voice lost in digital noise, buried beneath a neighborhood that never truly listened. And all it took to finally be heard was the curiosity of teenagers with a phone and a flashlight, and the courage to upload what they saw. As news of the horrified discoveries circulated, digital detectives, true crime podcasters, and social media sleuths began to dissect every clue linked to Marcus Lane and the mysterious username HelpMe417. Forums lit up with speculation. Someone pointed out that 417 matched the area code of Springfield, Missouri, raising suspicions that the number had significance beyond just a username. But it wasn't a geographic reference. It was a date, April 17th. Marcus had gone missing on April 17th, 5 years earlier. That alone suggested the username wasn't chosen randomly. It was a digital cry for help embedded in plain sight. Investigators began a deep dive into the online activity associated with the gaming cartridge. The software appeared to have been custom written, allowing short messages to be broadcast locally within a radius of roughly 150 feet. This limited range meant one haunting thing. The messages from HelpMe417 had only been visible to other players who were near the house on Hastings Street. The implications were devastating. Children in the neighborhood had likely walked past the house with their consoles in hand and received these desperate pings from beneath their feet. One chilling revelation came when a 13-year-old boy shared archived screenshots of his chat log from the year prior. He had thought he was interacting with a role player acting out a creepy persona. The messages seemed random and dark. Things like, "He hides a key," "The light is my only friend," and "I miss my mom's spaghetti." It was only after the story broke that he realized the timestamps matched dates when he had visited a friend who lived right next door to the abandoned house. In a desperate attempt to trace the origins of the hacked gaming cartridge, cybercrime units partnered with game developers. It turned out the modification had been done using open-source tools available on obscure forums. A deeper probe led to a user handle that posted a tutorial years ago about wireless distress signals using handheld devices. The IP address behind the account eventually traced back to an adult male who had once lived in the Hastings Street home, the same house where Marcus's remains had been found. The man in question was a former arcade technician named Gerald Minton, who had lost his own son to a rare illness a decade earlier. His background painted a disturbing portrait. After his son's death, Gerald had spiraled into isolation, becoming increasingly paranoid and obsessed with retribution. He believed society owed him something for his suffering. Former neighbors remembered him as quiet, odd, and reclusive, always tinkering with electronics in the garage. What few realized was that he had turned his grief into something monstrous. Gerald had allegedly abducted Marcus Lane with the belief that the child resembled his deceased son. Instead of seeking help or therapy, he recreated his lost reality inside the basement, forcing Marcus to wear his son's old clothes, eat from his son's dishes, and even play the same video games. But Marcus was never allowed outside. He was kept in complete darkness, save for a single flashlight, and fed sporadically. Over time, Marcus used the one tool at his disposal, a broken console, to try and reach the world above. Detectives recovered journals from Gerald's storage unit, filled with disturbing rants and drawings. Some described what he called the reset plan, a twisted theory in which he would bring back balance by punishing parents who didn't deserve their children. It was in one journal that they found the line, "If no one listens above, let the boy shout below. Let him be heard in bits and bytes." This single sentence explained everything. Gerald had coded the modified game as both a prison and a megaphone, a final irony where Marcus could scream, yet never be truly understood. Authorities now suspected Marcus may not have been Gerald's only victim. A second gaming device was discovered in a pawn shop across town, bearing similar modifications. The chat logs on that cartridge featured a different username, Player 2 Gone. Its messages were even more cryptic and frantic than those from Help Me 417. Some experts feared that it hinted at an earlier victim, one who may never have been found. The revelation sent shockwaves through the city. Parents checked their children's consoles for strange contacts. Schools held assemblies on digital safety. Lawmakers proposed Marcus's Law, a bill focused on mandatory inspections of condemned properties and stricter penalties for tech-based crimes against minors. But for many, the damage was already done. The trauma of knowing a boy had cried out digitally, unheard for years, left a scar that no legislation could ever erase. As the investigation deepened, the line between technology and tragedy grew more blurred. A child had turned a gaming console into a lifeline, hoping anyone, might hear him. And for years, he was ignored, his signals dismissed as nonsense, jokes, or pranks. But in the end, his voice did reach the surface, not through the systems designed to protect him, but through the random virality of social media. In a twisted way, the very medium used to ignore him became the one that finally told his story. The public's obsession with the Help Me 417 case spiraled far beyond anything law enforcement anticipated. Online communities began creating interactive maps of Gerald Minton's movements over the last decade, theorizing that other missing children could be connected to his twisted fantasy. Amateur investigators cross-referenced missing persons reports with Gerald's travel logs, property records, and even purchases from electronic retailers. The digital hunt expanded with viral hashtags like #Player2Gone and #FindTheOthers. While much of it turned into speculative noise, one unsettling lead emerged from a user who uncovered a security camera still frame from a toy store in 2016. In the blurry image was a man resembling Gerald holding a child's hand. The timestamp aligned with the last known location of a missing 9-year-old boy from Arkansas. Although no conclusive link was ever proven, this lead intensified national concern. If Gerald had abducted more than one child and used modified gaming consoles to trap or communicate with them, the implications were horrifying. Families of missing children across the country began submitting their kids' handheld devices to authorities. hoping for hidden messages or digital footprints. Forensic teams were overwhelmed. While most turned up nothing unusual, a few showed tampered software, messages that appeared nonsensical at first, but shared the same bleak tone and cryptic language as Help Me 417's chats. The possibility that these devices carried digital echoes of lost children became an obsession for both experts and the public. In the midst of this chaos, an independent cybersecurity firm conducted an audit of Marcus Lane's console. What they discovered wasn't just shocking, it was unprecedented. Hidden deep in the firmware was an audio file embedded using data compression techniques, so obscure they hadn't been used in over 15 years. After decrypting the file, a chilling 11-second recording was extracted. The muffled voice of a child whispered, "I'm still here. Tell my mom I didn't run away." He locked the door. The voice matched samples from Marcus's school recordings. Experts confirmed the file was last accessed just a week before the cartridge ended up in the thrift store bin. This meant Gerald had still been monitoring the system, possibly even altering messages before they reached the surface. This revelation sparked a renewed investigation into the timeline. Authorities were forced to reevaluate their assumption that Marcus had died years ago. Autopsy reports had suggested long-term malnourishment and stress, but not an exact date of death. Now, it seemed likely that Marcus had survived for several years underground, imprisoned in a fabricated reality created by a grieving madman. The idea that he had clung to hope for that long, creating coded messages to reach out, was both inspiring and heart-wrenching. Even more disturbing was a second detail in the audio file: background clicking noises. Sound engineers identified them as control button presses, rapid and rhythmic, possibly Morse code. When deciphered, the pattern translated to 417, 417, 417, repeated over and over. Marcus had embedded his final cry for help inside both voice and pattern, ensuring redundancy in case one failed. This level of awareness and desperation painted a clearer portrait of his terrifying endurance. He knew no one was coming, yet he still tried. As news outlets broadcasted the audio nationwide, public pressure mounted on local government and law enforcement. Critics questioned how an entire neighborhood could live above a makeshift prison without noticing anything. It was revealed that 2 years before Marcus was discovered, a complaint had been filed by a utility worker regarding strange noises coming from the basement. The complaint was dismissed without inspection. Another neighbor had submitted a noise complaint about strange clicking and buzzing sounds at night. Again, no follow-up occurred. Bureaucratic failures and general apathy had played a role in allowing the horror to continue unnoticed. A task force was formed to audit thousands of abandoned or condemned homes across multiple counties, using heat sensors and frequency scanners to detect unusual electronic signals. While no other victims were found using this method, it did uncover a number of illegally modified devices broadcasting encrypted audio. These weren't linked to Gerald, but the discovery opened a terrifying new chapter in law enforcement: digital confinement using low-tech hardware. The case forced a reckoning about how technology could be weaponized quietly, and how authorities lacked the protocols to recognize such silent abuse. Marcus Lane's funeral was attended by thousands, most of whom had never met him. People wore T-shirts with pixelated renderings of his avatar and a haunting quote, "Tell my mom I didn't run away." It became a national symbol of unheard children, their silent battles waged behind closed doors, hidden in basements, and broadcast in forgotten frequencies. In a final act of symbolic justice, the gaming community that had unknowingly dismissed Marcus's cries for help united to create a tribute game, titled 417. It was a silent exploration game in which the player had to piece together clues from garbled messages in a darkened world to find a lost child. All proceeds went to child safety tech initiatives and programs helping parents monitor digital platforms for hidden signals of abuse. Gerald Minton was posthumously diagnosed with severe paranoid delusional disorder. Though he died before facing trial, his legacy as one of America's most bizarre and cruel abductors remains. But Marcus's story, his silent voice that finally reached the surface, became louder than the monster who buried him. He was no longer just a missing child. He was a symbol of resilience in the darkest code, a child who turned a toy into a transmitter, and whose voice echoed long after the signal went silent. In the aftermath of the revelations, the legacy of the Help Me Force 17 case extended far beyond its initial digital horror. Schools across the country began implementing digital safety workshops, where children were taught not just how to avoid predators online, but how to discreetly ask for help if they ever found themselves in danger. Cybersecurity firms created software that could detect distress signals or suspicious messages embedded in games, apps, and even seemingly harmless media files. What was once regarded as a tragic anomaly now became the cornerstone of a growing awareness movement, one focused on recognizing that not all cries for help are loud, and not all prisons have walls. Lawmakers, pressured by public outrage, proposed new regulations around use electronics and retro gaming devices. Pawn shops, thrift stores, and secondhand sellers were now required to wipe consoles and cartridges through certified data sanitation programs. Forensic scanning of old devices became routine in some counties, particularly those with high missing persons rates. It was a grim but necessary response to the haunting realization that, like in Marcus's case, some victims had tried to leave breadcrumbs behind, and no one had been paying attention. The gaming community, once split between believers and skeptics, evolved. Online forums that had previously dismissed the Help Me Force 17 theory as a hoax issued public apologies. Influential streamers who had mocked the story returned to the topic, not just to express remorse, but to encourage their vast audiences to be vigilant and compassionate. Digital creators launched campaigns raising awareness about the importance of listening to even the most unbelievable stories. Believe first, debunk later became a viral slogan. Virtual monuments were constructed inside popular sandbox games, bearing messages in blocky letters. For 17 was real. In the academic world, Marcus Lane's experience became the subject of multiple psychological and criminological studies. Experts examined how long-term isolation in a technologically controlled environment had affected his mental state. Though little was known about his time in captivity, forensic psychologists pieced together behavioral patterns from his hidden messages. One common theme was repetition. Phrases, numbers, and coded routines. It indicated a child grasping for structure in chaos, using logic and code to maintain some sense of identity. His use of gaming metaphors to express suffering showed a harrowing blend of innocence and survival. Researchers concluded that Marcus hadn't just been trying to escape. He had been documenting, broadcasting, and enduring in the only way he could. Meanwhile, Gerald Minton's background continued to reveal unsettling details. A thorough search of his financial history showed that he had purchased multiple audio and signal jamming devices over the years, some from overseas retailers. These tools had likely been used to prevent wireless interference from the basement where Marcus was held. On several occasions, neighbors had complained of radio signal interference, but the source was never identified. Investigators now believe this technology helped Gerald evade detection, masking any sound or digital signal Marcus might have generated on his own. The level of planning and paranoia painted Gerald not as a disorganized predator, but a methodical captor with technical sophistication and an obsession rooted in loss and delusion. As the years passed, Marcus's name was spoken less often in the media, but his impact was deeply felt in quiet ways. A federal bill named the Marcus Lane Digital Safety Act was passed, mandating early warning systems for missing children based on abnormal digital activity. Algorithms were deployed on public networks and gaming servers to flag patterns similar to Marcus's coded cries for help. In several instances, these tools helped locate at-risk youth who had been groomed or coerced online. Though none of these cases reached the same chilling depth as Marcus's ordeal, each rescue felt like a small piece of redemption. Marcus's mother, who had suffered years of public scrutiny and quiet torment, eventually started a foundation in his name. The Lane Foundation funded trauma recovery programs for rescued children and hosted annual digital literacy seminars. She rarely spoke to media, but her presence at school events and gaming conventions became symbolic. She wore a simple lanyard with charm shaped like an old cartridge, engraved with the numbers for 17. It was both a memorial and a message, a reminder that behind every username might be a child hoping to be found. To this day, no one knows why Marcus chose the number 417. Some theorists claim it was his childhood street address. Others believe it was a code derived from the console's serial number or even the number of days he spent in captivity. But perhaps the truth doesn't matter. The number itself became immortalized. Online players began using 417 as a tag of solidarity. Custom avatars bore it on their digital clothing. Developers inserted Easter eggs into games, locker numbers, safe combinations, and room codes, all quietly honoring the boy who used the game to send a message. The story of Help Me 417, once dismissed as creepypasta or viral fiction, stood the test of scrutiny and time. It reminded the world that horror doesn't always wear a mask or carry a knife. Sometimes it whispers through static, hides in firmware, and waits behind the smiling avatar of a lonely gamer. But also showed that even in darkness, there's light, when one voice, however faint, finds a right ear. End of Story 4. Story 5. What if the 911 calls you answered were coming from the past? What if every panic voice, every cry for help, was tied to a town that no longer existed? And what if the last call was a stranger, but you begging for a rescue from a fire you started yourself? The night shift at the emergency dispatch center was often uneventful. Quiet stretches of time broken by the occasional car crash or domestic dispute. But on a humid Tuesday evening, something changed. A call came through the system at 3:17 a.m., the kind of hour where time feels elastic and reality bends at the edges. The line was filled with static, barely audible at first, but then came a voice, urgent, panicked, pleading for help. The caller gave an address in a town no one recognized, Asheville. At first, the dispatcher assumed it was a mistake. There was no town called Asheville in their jurisdiction. A quick check of the database confirmed it. No records, no map listings, nothing. He logged the call as a probable prank and moved on. But the voice lingered in his mind, the way the caller had screamed. The raw terror wasn't easy to fake. 2 nights later, another call came in. Same time, same voice. This time, the caller said there was someone trying to break into their home. More specific details came through. The creak of the stairs, the shadow outside the window, the sound of matches striking. Again, the address listed was in Asheville. The dispatcher felt a chill as he typed it into the system once more. Still, nothing. No GPS lock. No police jurisdiction. It was as if the town didn't exist. But something about the calls was different from typical hoaxes. The distress felt genuine. The kind of fear that lives in the throat, not the imagination. And there was a pattern forming. Each call came at exactly 3:17 a.m. Each time, the voice sounded more desperate, and each time, the caller described new horrors. Strangers standing in their yard, flames climbing the walls, smoke thickening the air. The dispatcher started digging. Off shift, he stayed late in the office, combing through old analog records and dusty filing cabinets. It was there he stumbled upon a thin manila envelope, misfiled under a different precinct. Inside were yellowing newspaper clippings dated 2003. Headlines jumped out like scars. Tragedy in Asheville. Town destroyed in mysterious fire. The article spoke of a sudden blaze that tore through the small rural community in the middle of the night. The cause was never determined. No official death toll was released, but the town was deemed a total loss. The strangest part was the lack of follow-up. No survivors interviewed. No lawsuits filed. No memorials. No public investigation. It was as if the fire had swallowed Not just a town, but the very memory of it. Back at the station, the dispatcher asked around. Most of his colleagues had never heard of Asheville. One older supervisor remembered vaguely hearing about it, but said it had vanished like a ghost town. The phrase stuck with him. A ghost town. Was that what this was? Over the next week, more calls came in. Some from women screaming for their children. Others from men whispering in fear, saying their doors wouldn't lock. One call was nearly silent, except for crackling of fire and a small child coughing in the background. Each call was tagged as untraceable. Each caller identified Asheville as their location. Yet when officers attempted to triangulate the calls or check routing data, nothing showed. It was like they came from nowhere. The dispatcher's obsession grew. He found archived photos of the town from the 1990s, quiet, rural, the kind of place with white picket fences and faded American flags. One photo showed the Asheville Volunteer Fire Department, its members smiling in front of a modest brick building. Another photo captured a town parade with children waving from wagons, faces without names, joy without context. Every image felt like a dream someone had forgotten. Then he noticed something else. In each photo, the same date appeared, August 19th, always in the background on banners or signs. That was the date of the fire. The same date the calls had begun, nearly 20 years later. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was a loop, a fracture in time that kept replaying itself through the only lifeline the victims ever had, 911. By now, the dispatcher had started recording the calls himself, not through the system, but on a separate device. He couldn't explain why, only that something told him these voices would be wiped clean if he didn't. And he was right. Each morning after the calls, when he checked the official system logs, the entries were blank, not erased, just never recorded, as if the calls had never happened at all. Sleep became difficult. The dispatcher would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the clock to strike 3:17 a.m. He kept his headset nearby, sometimes wearing it even while off duty, and sometimes, even when the system was off, he'd hear faint breathing through the earpiece. Breathing in distant crackles, like burning wood, like someone was waiting for him to answer. There was no more denying it. Asheville hadn't died in the fire. It had been trapped, frozen in the moment of its destruction. And somehow, impossibly, the town's final cries for help were bleeding through time, reaching the only lifeline left of them. But the dispatcher didn't yet understand the connection. Not fully. Not yet. The dispatcher's nights became rituals of obsession. Every detail mattered. The way the call started, always static first, then silence, then the voice, always at 3:17 a.m., always from Asheville. He began to recognize individual voices. A woman with a southern accent whispering prayers. A man repeating the same phrase over and over, "It's all my fault." A child sobbing, saying he couldn't find his parents. These weren't random screams. They were echoes, loops caught in a permanent state of panic, playing on repeat through the same dying minutes. Despite reporting the anomalies to his superiors, no formal investigation was ever launched. Officially, the calls didn't exist. The log system showed no entries, no timestamps, no recordings. He showed them the independent recordings he'd made, but they chalked it up to personal error or stress. One supervisor even suggested he take a leave of absence. That was when he realized the truth. He was alone in this. No one wanted to dig up the ghost town of Asheville. He started researching fire records, not just for Asheville, but neighboring areas. There were no clear causes documented for the blaze. The original fire report had been signed off by a man named Carl Dempsey, the town's fire chief, who reportedly died in the fire along with his entire team. Yet something strange stood out. Dempsey had made a call to the county dispatcher 3 minutes before the fire was officially reported. That call never made it into the records, but a handwritten note on the margin of the fire incident report said, The sirens never came. That line haunted him. Why did no one respond? How did a whole town burn without intervention? Was Asheville not on the emergency maps? Was it deliberately left off? Or had it disappeared in some way that defied documentation? He cross-referenced Asheville's postal and zoning records. Nothing. It was as though the town had been erased from a national infrastructure even before the fire. Not decommissioned, not absorbed, deleted. He tracked down a former firefighter who had worked in the region back in the early 2000s. The man, now retired and living off-grid, reluctantly confirmed that Asheville was real. He described it as a quiet, wooded community, mostly retirees and farmers. But he remembered something else. Strange dispatch signals would come in from that region long before the fire. Distorted voices, alarm bells that didn't belong to any system, reports of unexplainable incidents, animals found mutilated, power outages isolated to one street, clocks that stopped working at exactly the same time. And then there was the day Asheville went dark. No calls, no updates, just silence. And that silence never broke. It was as if the land swallowed the town and every soul within it. The retired firefighter had always believed the town had experienced something it was never meant to. A curse, a failure of reality, a punishment. Back at the dispatch center, the 3:17 a.m. calls began evolving. Instead of just voices, there were now strange distortions. Long stretches of static would be interrupted by sounds that didn't match the environment. A ticking clock, a woman laughing, a siren that faded into a lullaby. Some nights, he'd hear what sounded like dozens of voices layered on top of each other, all speaking in reverse, or perhaps in a language that hadn't been spoken in centuries. He began keeping journals, documenting every second of each call. But even his written records began changing. Dates would shift. Ink would smudge in patterns that resembled maps. Once, he found a page in his journal that he hadn't written, describing events he had yet to experience. In the margins, a child's handwriting appeared, spelling out, "Tell them to answer this time." The more he tried to warn others, the more isolated he became. Co-workers avoided him. Supervisors reassigned him to day shifts, but he found a way back onto the night roster. He needed to hear those calls. He needed to understand the message they were trying to deliver. Deep down, he believed that answering the calls might break the cycle, that acknowledging Asheville's cries might set the town free. But the tone of the calls changed again. The fear in the voices gave way to fury. Instead of pleas for help, the voices accused. They said things like, "You didn't come last time," and "We waited." One voice, the one he feared the most, whispered, "You were supposed to be here." That was the moment he began to consider the impossible. What if he had been connected to Asheville before the fire? What if he had been meant to answer, but failed? He searched through employment records, trying to determine who had been on shift the night Asheville burned. But the records for that date were missing, redacted, unavailable. The only thing he found was an old, faded access log with the initials DR. Those were his initials. His blood went cold. He hadn't worked dispatch in 2003. He was still in college. But somehow, the record said otherwise. The boundaries of time, memory, and guilt began collapsing. He no longer trusted the chronology of his own life. Had he somehow answered a call from past? Or failed to? Was this his punishment? His responsibility? The calls kept coming. And now, he recognized something else. His own voice, buried within the static, whispering apologies. The discovery of his initials in the access logs shattered any remaining confidence in reality. The timelines didn't match. The employment records didn't match. Yet the document existed. It wasn't just a paper. It was a deeper, intangible sense of certainty that gripped him, as though some part of his subconscious had always known. The dread of forgotten responsibility haunted him, like the sharp edge of a memory just out of reach. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. His life had become a cycle of waking nightmares wrapped in the static hum of unanswered calls. More troubling were the physical changes in his surroundings. He began noticing clocks behaving abnormally. All devices, his phone, the wall clock, digital dispatch monitors, would glitch or freeze at exactly 3:17 a.m., as if the entire world paused for that 1 minute. No software bugs were detected. Technicians found nothing wrong. But he knew. Time itself recoiled from Asheville's hour. That minute didn't just belong to the fire. It belonged to the town, the voices, and now to him. He tried to quit. He drafted a resignation letter multiple times, but each time he attempted to submit it, he found the file corrupted or mysteriously erased. Physical copies would vanish from his bag. Supervisors denied receiving anything. When he tried to speak to HR directly, they claimed his name wasn't in the system. It was as if the job had consumed him, like it had absorbed his identity and tethered him to the station permanently. Outside of the dispatch center, the world seemed to blur. Places he knew well felt unfamiliar. Friends stopped replying. Calls to family never connected. Even his reflection in mirrors seemed off. Delayed by just a fraction of a second, the voices in the calls grew sharper. Not just in clarity, but in intention. They were no longer desperate cries for help. They had purpose now. They began naming things. Repeating street names from Asheville. Repeating names of dispatchers long dead. They whispered cryptic phrases like, "The fire begins again," and "He's almost ready." It was no longer just horror. It was preparation. The patterns in the calls were pointing to something. A date. A recurrence. He compiled the call logs he'd tracked and aligned them with the fire's anniversary. Every year, in the week leading up to the anniversary, the calls increased in intensity. The messages grew bolder. In one recording, a young girl repeated, "For days left," over and over, her voice cracking like a scratched vinyl. The dispatcher realized the voices weren't trapped. They were rehearsing. Asheville was rehearsing its return, but not as a town, as a force, as a phenomenon that required attention, that demanded a witness. He mapped the audio frequencies of the static and uncovered that many of them mimic human brainwave patterns. It wasn't random interference. It was a signal designed to embed itself in the listener's mind. The calls were alive in some way, not like an AI, but like a collective echo, drawing energy from recognition. He was no longer answering them. They were answering through him. His thoughts became fragmented. He found scribbled notes in his own handwriting with no recollection of writing them. Phrases like, "You failed us," and "You will burn with us," covered the margins of his work notebook. The deeper he descended into the mystery, the more the physical world warped around him. Dispatch tapes for unrelated emergencies began containing ghost echoes from the Asheville calls. Even rookie operators began reporting hearing strange things in the headset. Lullabies and static, screams behind fire calls, whispering beneath car accident reports. The entire system was being infected. It wasn't just about Asheville's tragedy anymore. It was about spreading it, reproducing it. One chilling night, every dispatch line in the center rang at 3:17 a.m. Every operator answered. Every line was filled with silence. Then a single sound emerged across all headsets, a deep, resonant inhalation, as if the town itself was waking up again. The operators fell silent. No one spoke of it the next day. Some claimed it never happened. Others resigned without explanation. The dispatcher remained. He couldn't stop now. He realized Asheville was not a place. It had become a signal, a metaphysical anomaly born from ignored trauma. The town had burned, but its cries had never been acknowledged. That erasure transformed pain into something elemental, capable of growing, spreading, and returning. The dispatcher began receiving calls from towns he'd never heard of, ghost names, places that didn't appear on maps but seemed familiar. Each one carried a single warning. Asheville is not alone. The calls began naming him directly, his full name, his birth date. One voice said, "You are the second fire." Another whispered, "You will remember what you did." But he had no memory. No explanation. And then he did. A dream? No, a recollection of a time long ago where he was in a different dispatch center. A frantic call from Asheville. A young boy's voice begging for help. He had hesitated. He had dismissed it as a prank. The call had come at 3:17 a.m. He never logged it. The truth collapsed upon him. The voices were not strangers. They were the voices of those he had ignored. He had let them die. Asheville didn't need vengeance. Asheville needed him to remember. The moment the memory returned, the boundary between past and present crumbled entirely. It was no longer possible to separate hallucination from history. The calls, the voices of fire, all of it merged into one relentless cycle. The dispatcher finally understood that he had not just ignored a call from Asheville. He had unknowingly become its final gatekeeper, its chosen vessel for a reckoning years in the making. That missed call had not simply been a tragic oversight. It had been the spark. The fire was never just physical. The town's destruction had been fueled by a scream no one heard. The dispatcher hadn't just failed to answer a phone. He had failed to acknowledge a dying town's last hope. That guilt had festered in the static, in the wires, in the forgotten tapes buried beneath the system's endless updates. Asheville had learned to wait. And now, it didn't need help. It needed justice. The signals grew stronger as the anniversary drew closer. What were once fragmented whispers were now synchronized phrases, spoken in unity across every phantom call. You left us. You were supposed to save us. You are the reason we burn again. The dispatcher realized that the entire network had become haunted, not by ghosts in traditional sense, but by unresolved memory encoded into digital transmission. The trauma of Asheville had been digitized. It had embedded itself in every upgrade, every call log, every new recruit's headset. The town had become a virus in the emergency response system. And then came the blueprints. Printed pages left on his desk overnight and signed. They were architectural schematics, nearly identical copies of the Asheville 9-11 Dispatch Center's layout, even though it had been destroyed in the fire years ago. But these schematics bore the name of his current facility. The rooms, the wiring, the phone lines, it was all the same. The realization landed like a death sentence. His workplace wasn't just haunted by Asheville's memory. It had become Asheville. More anomalies began appearing. Dispatchers who had never been to Ohio reported vivid dreams of small-town fires. Some drew maps in their sleep. Others began muttering street names from Asheville while unconscious. The station's fire alarm would occasionally trigger at 3:17 a.m., always reporting a blaze in Sector Ash, a location that didn't exist. Even the fire suppression systems began malfunctioning on cue. It was no longer just about calls. The building itself was preparing for ignition. The dispatcher sought help from the few remaining people who believed him. A retired systems engineer confirmed that during the year of the Asheville fire, the backup servers had glitched due to a data overload caused by an unclosed line, a call that never resolved. It stayed active in the system for 7 hours before it was forcibly terminated. That call had come from Asheville. It had been the boy, and the engineer had flagged it, but no one followed up. The audio was corrupted. The metadata erased itself shortly after. What remained was an invisible scar in the system's memory, a wound that had never healed. That unclosed line became the epicenter. From it, new calls branched out. Not real emergencies, but echoes. The system kept generating simulations of help that never came. The dispatcher was now caught in a recursive loop. Every shift, every call, every headset played with increasingly clear recreations of that final plea, each one subtly different, some more desperate, others more accusatory, all of them growing louder, more defined, more human. Then, on the night of the fire's anniversary, the system went dark at exactly 3:17 a.m. Every screen flickered, then displayed a single line of text. Call accepted. That was followed by a transcript. It was a full version of the original call from Asheville. The boy's voice, now unmarred by distortion, repeated the same plea again and again. "Please don't hang up. I'm still here. I'm still burning." The dispatcher finally understood the final message. Asheville didn't just want revenge. It didn't just want to be remembered. It wanted to relive. It wanted to be answered. And in that understanding, the cycle completed. The signal that had been waiting years for recognition was finally acknowledged. But instead of stopping, it evolved. The fire didn't reignite physically. It began broadcasting. Other dispatch centers across the country began reporting similar phenomena, ghost calls from towns that had suffered similar tragedies, long-forgotten accidents, floods, shootings, fires. Every unanswered emergency cry found a voice again through the same signal. It wasn't just Asheville anymore. The entire emergency network was awakening to a chorus of the forgotten. The dispatcher became a symbol, an unwilling prophet of unfinished business. His story spread online through forums and emergency responder groups, half-believed urban legend, half-creeping reality. Recordings leaked. Transcripts appeared in dispatcher training manuals under anomalous behavior. But no one could stop it, because deep down, everyone in the system had ignored something. A dropped call, a misjudged prank, a hesitated decision. And now, the voices had a path back. Asheville burned once. Now it echoed forever. And every time a dispatcher picks up the line and hears nothing but static, they can't help but glance at the clock, waiting to see if it's 3:17 a.m. The end. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Mr. DarXnights for more chilling true crime and horror stories. Also, drop your thoughts and any story suggestions in the comments below. We love hearing from you. Stay safe and see you in the next video.